4. Business on the Frontier. Manchester, England and Istanbul, Turkey, May 25th to the 26th. Now and again, on British television's networked news, there were reports from Afghanistan. Sometimes these were documentary films, taken at great risk by cameramen and reporters who had trekked across the mountain ranges from Pakistan and actually brought back film of the fighting. Sometimes there was only a map of leaf-shaped Afghanistan, stretching from China to Iran, with a voiceover saying that resistance was continuing, that this or that town or province was in revolt. Mr. Pendergood always followed those pieces of news with great attention. He listened to the radio too, both at home, the luxurious house in the northern English town where he had his prosperous road haulage and other businesses, and in his Jaguar as he gunned it along the motorways to visit one or other of his branch managers. When he heard that the United Nations had condemned the Russians for the invasion, he had hoped that something would now be done. Nothing was. Then he thought that the Soviets would withdraw after the unanimous resolution of the representatives of the Islamic states condemning them. After all, the USSR was supposed to be the champion of the emerging nations and the anti-imperialists. But they did not. Several Western nations showed displeasure at the first Russian attempt to conquer a country outside the Soviet sphere of influence since World War II. The USA, for instance, boycotted the Moscow Olympics. But after a decent interval, trade and cultural relations began to return to normal. Even the wrist-slapping was over. Pendergood, listening to the radio over his morning cup of Earl Grey tea one day, heard two scraps of news. The first was that the Geneva Conference, supposed to solve the Afghan problem, had collapsed. The second was that the proportion of Afghan civilians already killed was greater than those who might have died in a world nuclear war. Pendergood had made up his mind even before the newsreader came to the item about the alleged use of poison gas. He was single, 53, and had been described in his local newspaper as amiable and massively built, a pillar of the community, Rotarian and transport king. Mr. Pendergood reckoned that, amiable or not, the time had come. Enough was enough. He bathed, did his 50 press-ups, dressed in one of his impeccable grey chalk-striped suits, and called his general manager. Then he visited his lawyer to arrange for the sale of his extensive assets, and told his secretary to call the travel agent who specialized in Middle Eastern matters for top people, with efficiency and discretion, Hogg Robinson in London's Kingsway. Before lunch, he was getting 130 miles an hour out of the car as he flogged it down the motorway towards Heathrow Airport. As the English countryside, in all its astonishing neatness, flashed past, Pendergood wondered whether a police patrol would pick him up. He almost hoped they would. Providing he did not refuse to stop, they would not arrest him. They only gave you a summons. And who was going to enforce that, and where? On the empty passenger seat lay the object he had taken from the wall, inside the front door of his mock Georgian house on the way out. An Afghan dagger with the seal of Solomon on the hilt, mark of one of the master smiths of the frontier. Tucked into a slit in the deerskin scabbard was the usual trophy, the scrap of fading, coarse material, cloth from the knife's first victim. From the uniform jacket of a redcoat in the First Anglo-Afghan War. It had been his grandfather's, and given to Pendergood when he was only 10 years old. As a boy, he had never looked at the weapon with particular pride, never thought that he, Pendergood, would one day be a United Kingdom citizen, anglicised into the respected Mr. Pendergood, company director who read the Daily Telegraph and was from time to time invited to give prizes at charity occasions. Most of his fellow Britishers, certainly until a few months ago, would not have been able to locate Afghanistan on a world map. But Pendergood, like his ancestors since long before the ancient Greek geographers had reported to the west about his tribe, the warlike Apridae, the Afridi of today, knew where it was. And he knew that the people of the free land needed him. Pendergood parked the Jaguar at the Heathrow long-term car park and took the courtesy bus to Terminal 2. Then he checked in for flight TK90, takeoff time 09:45. His neighbour in the jetliner introduced himself as a scientist, heading for Anatolia to advise on soil erosion problems, sent by a major British university. "I am honoured," said Pendergood in his agreeable North Country English voice. "And as for me, I am the Khan Payanda Gul Khan of the Pashtun land. My name means everlasting flower in the trans-border territory. I have a business matter to attend to." "Indeed," said the academic, turning his grey face, grey-rimmed glasses, and grey look upon the swarthy tycoon. "And what might your avocation be?" "I have recently retired from commerce," said Mr. Pendergood, "and my family have trouble with their neighbours over who owns what, so I am going back to help them sort it out." The conversation lapsed, and Pendergood's thoughts went back to that day, 33 years ago, when he had taken a flight to Paris on the off chance that he might be able to meet another man also of Pashtun blood. 2 decades before, the man's father and Pendergood's had, at the head of the Pashtun armies, stormed the stronghold of the tyrant usurper of Kabul's throne. Now the son's standard waved over the Krillin Hotel. His name was His High Royal Presence, King Idries Shah. Inside the hotel, Pendergood had put on his Afghan cap, of rare golden karakul fur with tiny curls, and sat in the lounge while he watched various people coming and going. He followed some of them, finally, up the broad stairs to the first floor. More people were standing on almost every step and in the corridors, waiting to see the great man. Some had parcels, others letters. One man had a huge and elaborately polished saddle, fit for a king, at his feet. They all looked like Frenchmen, and as if they wanted something badly. Probably money. Pendergood ignored them and pressed on. Finally he saw a door and a small group being ushered into an anteroom. Pendergood followed them and, like them, sat down. After a few minutes they disappeared, at someone's beckoning, through a door at the far end of the room. A few minutes later the courtier showed them out. Coming back, he looked at Pendergood and, assuming that he had an arranged audience, signalled him to follow. In a few seconds, Pendergood was in a large room with 2 rows of straight-backed Louis XIV chairs down the middle. The rows faced one another, and only one chair was occupied. On it sat the king, a tall man with black, piercing eyes and an athlete's build. The half-dozen courtiers present were standing along the walls of the room where they could not hear any conversation. Pendergood walked up to his monarch and kissed his hand and, with the Pashtun's usual aplomb, sat down and began to talk. After all, a king was just a type of tribal chief. "Pendergood of the Pashtuns from Afridi land at the service of His Majesty," said Pendergood. "You are welcome. May you never be tired. What work are you doing?" The king was wearing a grey, single-breasted suit and sat very straight. He had a moustache and he was going bald. He was about 40, Pendergood knew, although he looked rather older, certainly older than his photographs. Still, he'd been on the throne since he was 19. His father, Marshal Nadir, was killed by a disaffected student in 1933, and Zahir Shah had reigned since then. "May it be acceptable to His Majesty, engaged in commerce in England and free for any service commanded by the imperial presence, sir." The king sat quietly. Pendergood said nothing. He had, after all, only come to render homage to his king. He'd used the customary formula, but didn't need a job. Paindagul Khan, you are welcome to come to Kabul to serve your country. We can find some work for you. There is need of people with experience. Your Majesty has honoured me, and I rejoice that we have such a great king. All my work is for you, for the people, said Zahir. Thank you for coming, Paindagul Khan. May your life be long. May His Majesty live forever. Pendergood had taken his hand and kissed it, as the king made the customary modest gesture of snatching it away. It wasn't the content of the meeting. Pendergood knew that chiefs and monarchs seldom said anything of consequence at audiences. It was the fact that he had now met the king, and he had pledged his loyalty to the Afghan land. The king had later not acquiesced in the Russian occupation. From his Italian exile, he had just stated that it was his wish that things could be put to rights. He took no active part, but saw himself as the unifying element. Pendergood understood. Others were trying to form a government in exile, but the war would have to go on. He was now on his way to see an arms dealer in Istanbul. He would do some buying. After that, he would join the fight. Pendergood thrust Paris and the Krillin out of his mind as the stewardess came past, making sure that seatbelts were fastened. Turbulence, she said. Turbulent. That's what the British had always called the tribes. The Romans had called the British that too, once upon a time. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. This is Captain Kaiser. In a few moments, at 16:05 local time, we shall be landing at Yeşilköy Airport in Istanbul. Thank you for being with us, and please fly again with Turk Hava Yolları. Pendergood had forgotten to fill in his disembarkation card. The woman at the immigration control window said that she would do it for him to save time. She took his British passport from him. No, I'd better do it, he said. I've got a foreign name, you see. It's Gul, spelt... She smiled at him. You think I can't spell Gul? It's one of our own names too. Nobody in England had ever been able to spell his name. I'll soon be there. I'm halfway home at least, Paindagul told himself as the bus took him through the outer suburbs towards Taksim. At least the Turks were not asleep, he thought, as he passed the huge posters with their slogan, Crush Communism. The Russians had been trying to conquer Turkey too for centuries. He would make certain arrangements with the arms merchant in Istanbul, and then visit the gunrunners of the Afghan borderland.